Good day. As I make this program today, I continue to focus largely on the Ukrainian conflict because it seems to me that this still remains the pivotal conflict in world affairs. And perhaps the big news in relation to this conflict is of what I suspect are massive rows going on behind the scenes in two capitals, or at least in two countries, Russia and the United States, about the conduct of the war. The Russian quarrel is being conducted to a great extent in public. In the United States, things are happening behind the scenes, but it's not, I think, particularly difficult to decipher the clues. Anyway, let's first of all talk about what is happening on the battlefronts. And the key battle area remains Bakhmut. And yesterday, there were multiple reports about a Ukrainian counterattack. Some of these reports came from no less a person than General Syrskyi, Ukraine's ground forces commander. He issued a statement saying that Ukraine had launched a counterattack in Bakhmut and had driven the Russians back from certain particular buildings or blocks of buildings. It wasn't to me very clear. His explanation, Syrskyi's explanation of what had happened, was actually altogether very vague. Too vague to be taken up by the Western media to any great extent, though there was a brief report about it in Reuters. And elsewhere, there were also reports from various Telegram channels, Russian, Ukrainian, also discussing this counterattack. Now, it's very difficult to get an overall picture as to exactly what did happen. But the general consensus seems to be that the Ukrainian army did launch some kind of a counterattack. Overall, it doesn't appear to have achieved very much, but it might just possibly have pushed the Russians back off the road from Chasov Yar to Khromovo. This may have been the major purpose of this particular counterattack. I'm not absolutely certain that this was the case, and there's been very little information about it one way or the other. But anyway, that may be what happened. Now, for the record, Russian media agencies this morning, this is May the 2nd, do not seem to be talking very much about this counterattack at all. It's as if essentially whatever it was that happened, and then we all went back to the situation pretty much as we were before. But for what it's worth, I'm going to just briefly go to Redovka, which is, as I said, that newspaper based in Smolensk, which has a website, and it has only a very short report about the fighting in Bakhmut. It says, according to the head of the Wagner PMC, who is, of course, Prigozhin, at the moment, the Russians control 45,000 square meters of Bakhmut. Over the past day, that would be May the 1st, they advanced by 120 meters, and that they continue to storm positions in the northern, western, and southern parts of the city. And in addition, Russian forces took control of territory on the other side of Tchaikovsky Street. Very brief report, not really very informative, but anyway, that is what Redovka was saying as of late last night. So that might be indeed what is happening in Bakhmut, that there was a Ukrainian counterattack. Perhaps it did drive the Wagner forces off the road. Perhaps not. Perhaps the road continues to be much unusable, much as before. But according to this report from Redovka, within Bakhmut itself, the Russians are continuing incrementally to carry on advancing, that there's been no report, not very much information about this in the Russian media or elsewhere. Now, I would point out that May the 1st is a very important holiday in Russia. I believe the holiday continues into May the 2nd, also, by the way, though I'm not sure about that. So perhaps expecting very much information on what is, after all, a major holiday might be asking for too much, and it could be that we're not getting very much information purely for that reason. Anyway, that now brings me to the evidence of the row, because there clearly was or has been a row, and we can say this because there's been a furious, incredibly prolonged message on his Telegram channel by Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group. And it makes excoriating reading. He says that the Wagner Group is only getting a third of the ammunition that it wants. He blames the deaths on a single day, or at least I'm not sure it's deaths, casualties on a single day, of 94 Wagner fighters on the fact that the Wagner organization isn't receiving the ammunition that it needs. He complains bitterly that the Russian forces on the flanks of the Wagner organization are not really providing the kind of defense that they should be, and that this is putting the Wagner organization forces in Bakhmut themselves in peril. He's talking about how the Russian military overall is unprepared for the offensive that Ukraine is going to launch. He said that the offensive is going to be launched sometime before the 15th of May, and about that he is absolutely certain. He talks of treason at the highest levels of the Russian command. He says that at some point the people who have betrayed Russia in this kind of way are going to be held to account. Now, as I said, for a few weeks it looked as if this simmering feud between Prigozhin and the Russian leadership in the Ministry of Defense had been overcome, that the two were cooperating properly again. But this furious, angry tirade has obviously blown this truce, if truce it was, apart. Now, the big question is there any truth to what Prigozhin is saying? Or is this story actually correct? Is he really telling us, describing the situation as it really is? It's very difficult to say with Prigozhin because he is an extremely emotional man. That's obviously clear. He's also there, as I said, with his troops in the thick of the fighting. He is not a person with a military background. He is not somebody who is high up in the command chain of the Russian armed forces. He's obviously not in a position to second guess the thinking of the Russian General Staff and of the Ministry of the Defense. I don't get the sense that the Russian High Command shares his battle plans with him, which is hardly surprising given, as I said, that he makes outbursts of this kind. I also have to say that Simplicius the Thinker is providing one of these interesting sites, very interesting site, has provided copies of what he says is a document or two documents from the Russian Ministry of Defense, which provides a breakdown of the ammunition the Wagner organization has been receiving through March and April. And he makes the point, Simplicius the Thinker does, that the amount of ammunition that the Wagner organization has been getting has been very substantial indeed, translating to well over 1,000 rounds of heavy ammunition heavy shells, 122 millimeter and 155 millimeter shells a day, the equivalent of it. Now, bear in mind that at the beginning of March, the Ukrainian military, for its part, was down to firing around 1,000 shells a day across the entire front line. And the Wagner organization seems to have been receiving that number of shells from the Russian Defense Ministry, or at least the equivalent of that number of shells from the Russian Defense Ministry for every day of that same period. And that doesn't look like the Wagner organization objectively has been experiencing any fundamental shortage of shells. I'm going to make my guess here about what has happened. I think two things have happened. The first is clearly there was some kind of a fight in Bakhmut, and clearly the Wagner forces in Bakhmut, which was said by the Americans, by the way, to number around 6,000, suffered a bad mauling. According to Prigozhin, 94 men were killed or wounded in one particular day, which is an awful lot, far more than usual. Usually around 20 men apparently get wounded or killed in the fighting in Bakhmut. On this one day, it was 94, according to Prigozhin. And I think that clearly put him in a very, very bad mood, and it caused him a lot of anger, and he let out that anger in this, as I said, furious tirade. The other thing that might have played a role is the dismissal or perhaps reassignment of General Mizintsev, who is the Russian officer, was the Russian officer, who had been put in charge of the logistics supply for the military forces in Ukraine, the Russian military forces fighting this war in Ukraine. Now, Mizintsev is an interesting man. He has been previously providing a lot of information. He was coordinating the civilian humanitarian relief response of the Russian military in this war. And then, as part of the reassignments that took place in the autumn, he was put in overall charge of logistics and has held that post since. But now he seems to have been replaced, all of which, by the way, it's just a further replacement in a string of replacements that have been taking place across the Russian military over the last few days as the Russian military prepares to meet Ukraine's offensive. Now, Simplicius the thinker says that Mizintsev had a close relationship with Prigozhin, and that ammunition, this oversupply of ammunition to the Wagner group might have been the result of Mizintsev's actions, and that other units within the other forces within the Russian military and the Russian Ministry of Defense leadership might have been feeling that Mizintsev was going too far, that he was prioritizing excessively supply of ammunition to the Wagner organization over other formations, Russian military formations fighting on the battlefield, and that might have been why he was replaced. Now, if that is right, I can understand why, at a time when perhaps the Ukrainians launched a partially successful counterattack, perhaps pushing the Russian forces off the road, and when Wagner forces might have suffered a disproportionately high loss rate on one particular day, 94 casualties in one particular day, I can understand why. All of that, perhaps in conjunction with the sacking, if that's what it was, of Mizintsev, might have upset Prigozhin as a sort of fiery character, as we know that he is, leading to his extraordinary outburst, which we've just seen. Having said that, there is an argument against it, which is that we don't know for a fact, first of all, that Mizintsev and Prigozhin were close to each other. And Prigozhin has repeatedly complained over the last couple of months about lack of supply of shells. And it might just be that all of these complaints, which were taking place whilst Mizintsev was in charge of overall ammunition supply, it could be that all of these complaints were a sign not of good relations between Prigozhin and Mizintsev, but on the contrary, of very bad relations between Prigozhin and Mizintsev. That Prigozhin might have been feeling that Mizintsev wasn't giving him enough of what he wanted, even if in objective terms, he was getting an awful lot. In that case, it's not impossible that Mizintsev's dismissal is a gesture, is a sign that, this internal argument is tilting in Prigozhin's favor. I don't know. But anyway, it is a furious row, and I think that increasingly there's going to be a widespread feeling in the Russian political and military leadership that for all his outstanding qualities as a leader, Prigozhin is beginning to behave a bit like a loose cannon, and that he does perhaps rather excessively give the impression that the only organization that is actually fighting in Ukraine on the Russian side is the Wagner Group, which of course is not the case and never has been. And I can't help but think that in time that may work against Prigozhin's interests politically. When the war is over, he does seriously risk being frozen out. Anyway, it's difficult, as I said, to get a complete sense of what is going on. The fact is, and I've said this previously, if things were as bad as Prigozhin says, then why is his force continuing to advance? Why has it been advancing for several months? It doesn't seem to me that that is consistent with the Russian Defense Ministry failing to provide the Wagner organization with support, as Prigozhin sometimes implies, or sometimes outright says, even if perhaps he's not getting quite as much support as he would like. So that's what I'm going to say about this row. What I will say is that on the eve of the Ukrainian offensive, which we still don't quite know when it's going to happen, this row between Prigozhin and the Russian Defense Ministry is going to be very unwelcome in Moscow. As Simplicius correctly says, it leaves a very bad taste in the mouth. A lot of people are speculating about the state of the military in the Russian military. And given that Prigozhin, whatever else, has achieved a very substantial support club in Russia, a lot of people are going to be taking his criticisms as true, and it is going to weaken confidence in the state of the Russian military. I think, as I said previously, that a lot of people in Moscow are going to be very, very angry over Prigozhin's comments, and though I suspect that Someone, Putin probably, will act to put this anger aside and to try to get everybody working again with each other. There will be consequences after the war has ended. Now, the row that is going on the other side is very different, though I am confident that such a row has taken place. And oddly enough, it relates also to the events in Bakhmut. And here we begin with a really quite extraordinary comment by the spokesman, not of the Pentagon, as I have been referring to him recently, but as a particularly helpful viewer pointed out to me, a spokesman, a person who is in charge of communications, but who is, properly speaking, perhaps the voice of the National Security Council in the United States, who is John Kirby. Kirby was for a time the Pentagon spokesman. He was then reshuffled. Always interesting when that kind of thing happens. To the White House. He's not the chief White House spokesman, but he seems to speak for the National Security Council. In other words, his titular boss is the president himself, but he probably takes his instructions, his everyday instructions, from the president's national security advisor, who is, of course, Jake Sullivan. Anyway, Kirby came up with a really very bizarre comment yesterday. He said that over the last few months, the Russians, since December, in fact, the Russians have lost 20,000 men killed. And he said that 10,000 men, 10,000 of the half of these men who have been killed are convicts recruited into the Wagner organization who've been hurled into battle virtually without training in the fight for Bakhmut. And Kirby said that the Russian winter offensive has failed, that Russian resources have been drained, that the Russian state of the Russian military is dire, all ahead of this Ukrainian offensive that is about to be launched. Now, I'm going to say straight away that I think Kirby's comments are, on the face of them, absurd. In fact, they are so absurd that the Western media, the British media at least, has reported them, obviously, but has done so with minimal comment, as if, this is too much, even for the British media to take as absolutely true. And Kirby's comments are so vehement, that to me, they bear the hallmarks of statements made publicly in connection with what I am sure is a bureaucratic row, a bureaucratic battle that is taking place inside Washington. Now, I speak here without direct knowledge. This is to some extent a guess, but it is an informed guess. I have worked in public institutions close to government. I have some experience of how these kind of things, these kind of rows play themselves out in public, how statements are made publicly which are really moves in an internal bureaucratic battle, and it's not necessarily clear to those on the outside exactly what is going on. Let's first of all talk about Kirby's claims, 20,000 men. Now, this is a number that has come out of nowhere. Kirby doesn't really provide any explanation for it. The Pentagon leaks showed that casualty totals that have been coming out of Washington or that have been circulating within Washington come exclusively from Ukraine, and that the Pentagon itself has very, very low confidence in them. So this is, as I said, a figure that seems to have been plucked largely out of the air, might have originated in Ukraine, probably did, but it is, as I said, something that we've had no preparation for. It's an astronomically high figure, even by US and Ukrainian standards. And as I said, it's really unsupported by much in the way of detail. And what about those 10,000 convicts who were supposed to have been thrown into the battle? Well, again, if 10,000 convicts were killed in the fighting in that kind of way, there would certainly have been some kind of echo of this within Russia itself. We've not seen anything. The British media and Media Zone conduct, the BBC to be precise, and Media Zone conduct regular surveys of people of Russians who've died in battle in Ukraine. They track cemetery records, social media reports, all that kind of thing. I think their last figure, global figure for the entire conflict, was around 16,000 killed. Perhaps that's an underestimate. But if 10,000 people, men, had died over the last couple of months, I am sure 10,000 convicts had died over the last couple of months and 20,000 in total. I am sure this would have appeared somewhere. This would not have been possible to conceal in that kind of a way. And I'm also going to say that there would be repercussions. The families of these people, all that kind of thing, would have been surely out there complaining and protesting about this. It's also inconsistent with what we know about the nature of the fighting in Bakhmut itself. And we've now had a large number of eyewitness reports about the nature of the fighting from Ukrainian soldiers. And what they say is this, that the Russians, the practice of the Russians in the fighting in Bakhmut is that small groups of Wagner soldiers, we're talking about 5, 6 groups of 5 or 6, things like that, approach Ukrainian positions, reconnoiter them, draw Ukrainian fire, identify where the Ukrainians are, and then the Russians shell the Ukrainian positions, and then this pattern repeats itself until the position has become untenable, at which point the Russians simply occupied after the Ukrainians have basically left. In other words, fighting does take place, sometimes fierce hand-to-hand fighting, but that is not the general pattern of the battle in Bakhmut. And I have repeatedly said, and it has been generally acknowledged, that all that talk of human waves, of Russian soldiers being sent in human waves to fight, and convicts being sent in human waves to fight, is simply incorrect. It simply isn't true. Now, Prigozhin himself did, in the autumn, tour the various prisons and penal colonies across Russia, and he did recruit a large number of young men into the Wagner organization, a rather controversial episode, by the way, in Russia, and eventually somebody seems to have told him to call it off because he stopped doing it. And anyway, he did recruit a large number of young men from the prisons with promises of pardons. And presumably, by the way, these pardons come from Putin, who is the only person who, as president of Russia, is in a position to grant pardons. Now, we don't know how many people Prigozhin was able to persuade to join the Wagner organization. I've seen some reports which suggest that the Russian prison population, about which I'm going to say a little more in a moment, that the Russian prison population fell by 23,000 between the summer and the late autumn, and that this is an unprecedentedly large drop, which it probably is. And this has been attributed mainly to Prigozhin's recruitment efforts. But if this has indeed happened, then I would suggest that, again, those 20,000 young men recruited from the prisons in that kind of way almost certainly would not have been thrown instantly into battle by the Wagner forces. Most probably they would have undertaken some kind of course of training. There would be little point in sending untrained men to fight, and the likelihood is that they're probably only now reaching that level of proficiency where they can be engaged in the fight at all. And that assumes, of course, that all those 23,000 men joined the Wagner organization. We don't know that that is the case. I'm going to make a general point here, one that is very little known in the West, almost entirely unreported in the Western media. But one of the major stories of the Putin years has been of an extraordinary improvement in the law and order situation in Russia and a corresponding collapse in the size of Russia's prison population. When Putin became president of Russia back in 2000, I recall that Russia's prison population was well over 1 million. It was only a couple of 100,000 less than that of the United States, which, of course, has double Russia's population, more than doubles Russia's population. The proportion of young Russian men in Russian prisons at the time when Putin became president was enormous. And as somebody who visited Russia in the 1990s, I can say that this was also, all this huge number of young Russians in prison at that time, corresponded with an extremely bad law and order situation in Russia. It was a country with a great deal of violence, criminal violence at that time. Gangster groups were rife. One used to hear stories about how during the spring thaw, when the snow melted, dead bodies used to be found on the streets and things of that kind. Anyway, from that peak of over 1 million convicts, the Russian prison population fell by August to around 350,000. So this is a huge decline over admittedly a period of 20 or so years. So this has not been the result of strange policies of not prosecuting violent offenders or ignoring certain types of crimes and things of that kind. Certain activities have been decriminalized, but these are of a commercial and economic nature, which arguably should not have been criminal in the first place. But anyway, there's been a general, very, very high improvement in the law and order situation in Russia, and at the same time, the prison population has fallen markedly. And it is continuing to fall. It was continuing to fall right through 2022. The trend continues to remain firmly downwards. So it could be that, some of these 20,000 men who disappeared from the Russian prisons over the course of the late summer, autumn, early winter, went and joined the Wagner organization. It's quite likely that the prison population continued its downward trend anyway. It's difficult to say. But anyway, one way or the other, I don't believe this number of 10,000 convicts supposedly killed in battle. There's no photographic evidence that I've seen that comes anywhere close to confirming it or to bearing it out. And it seems wild and bizarre altogether. So what has happened? Why did Kirby come up with this statement? Well, I don't think it's difficult. There's been a lot of comment and concern expressed right across the Western media over the last few weeks about the state of the Ukrainian military, the heavy losses that Ukraine's military has experienced, the fact that Ukraine is being pushed into an offensive that is perhaps unwise, and that this offensive is going to be hampered by very severe ammunition shortages and by the poor level of training of the Ukrainian troops. And I suspect that Kirby, who acts, as I said, effectively the representative of the National Security Council, has been pushed forward by the hardliners, the neocons, whose major power center within the national security establishment is the National Security Council, that he's been pushed forward to argue that people who have doubts about the Ukrainian offensive should shut up. Whatever problems Ukraine has, Russia's problems are much worse. They depleted their forces over the course of this winter offensive that they supposedly launched. They've lost tens of thousands of men. They're out of artillery. They're out of weapons. They're not really ready to push or fight back. And that if Ukraine does launch an offensive now, it has every prospect of success. So I think this is what this very bizarre comment from Kirby was intended to convey. And as I said, it almost certainly reflects arguments within the US government, because all of these reports about all of these problems that Ukraine is suffering, about the doubts that Ukraine's offensive is going to be successful or effective, they actually are coming to us from sources within the US government. And an accumulation of reports and rumours suggests that a lot of these concerns originate with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in other words, with the Pentagon, and perhaps with General Milley himself. And note that within hours of Kirby making these extraordinary assertions, we had Milley talking to General Zaluznhy, the Ukrainian Chief of Staff. Now, I'm going to make a further guess here. It is only my own guess. I think that what's happened is that someone has wanted to at least postpone this offensive. There were reports a couple of days ago that Zaluznhy himself wanted to postpone the offensive to June. He feels that the Ukrainians aren't ready to launch this offensive at the moment. They don't have enough weapons. They're not trained. They are very, very short of ammunition. Their prospect of success, if they launch it now, is limited. And I think there was a row about this in Washington. Kirby was sent to tell the world and, in effect, silence the doubters within the US government by saying, well, this is nonsense. We have to have this offensive now because the Russians are basically on their back. They've been pummeled because their winter offensive went horribly wrong and they've suffered all these casualties. And Milley was then ordered to call Zaluznhy and tell Zaluznhy, look, we've heard your concerns, but the reality is you must start this offensive as soon as possible, and it must happen this month. You can't postpone it further to June. That is my reading of this. Now, I would stress again, I don't know this all for a fact. We're reading the runes, if you like. But as I said, I have been involved in bureaucratic battles myself. And this has all the signs of it. The fact that Kirby comes out with this extraordinary statement, and then a few hours later, Milley, the skeptic, the person everybody agrees is the skeptic, on the phone to Zaluznhy. A few hours later, it looks to me, as I said, as if Milley has been told to fall into line, which, by the way, Milley invariably does. So, likelihood is we're going to get this offensive fairly soon. And I'm not going to speculate or guess further about that, about the direction where this offensive is going to come or anything of that kind, because I don't know. I saw a report from a Ukrainian channel, I think it was Legitimy, but I'm not sure, that supposedly Zelensky has confirmed to General Syrski that the Ukrainian military has Zelensky's permission to launch a counterattack in the Bakhmut area, and that Bakhmut must be defended at all costs. So perhaps the starting point of this offensive will be Bakhmut, and this report suggested that this counterattack will take place on the 4th and 5th of May. There are, by the way, very conflicting reports about the state of the weather, the state of the weather through May. Some meteorological reports that I've seen suggest that weather conditions are going to be mixed. There will be periods of warm weather when conditions will dry out, but also that there will also be periods of heavy rain when the ground will become presumably softer again. So who's to say? We'll see what happens. But I predict that we will see this offensive happen and that it will take place this month. I think that almost certainly, this is how I read the Kirby, Milley actions. The president himself has intervened. We see, as I said, Kirby coming up with this extraordinary statement, and Milley told to talk to Zaluznhy and to get Zaluznhy to order that this offensive take place as soon as possible and not be postponed again until May, until June. Now, a number of further things to say about this offensive. There's been numerous reports now about how the first hours of the offensive, the first days of the offensive, are going to be decisive. Ukraine must break through supposedly within the first 24 hours, or if it doesn't, the offensive presumably will fail. Confident hopes, which is really what that the Russian military, if there is a breakthrough, that the Russian military will panic and flee. And that's essentially, it seems to me, what Kirby is talking about. That's really what he's wanting everybody to think. That's why he's coming up with these astronomical casualty figures. I'm going to suggest that the real reason why this offensive has to succeed within the first couple of days, or perhaps let's be generous and say first couple of weeks, is a very simple and very practical one. Beyond that point, Ukraine is simply going to run out of shells. There just hasn't been any success on the part of the Western powers in outfitting, supplying to Ukraine the amount of ammunition it needs to conduct a successful offensive. It's as simple as that. So unless this offensive can break through, take Melitopol, or reach Melitopol, or come within artillery range of Crimea, or break through to the Sea of Azov, or march east rather, and take Belgorod, or relieve Bakhmut, or do any one of those things within a couple of days or weeks at most, then the whole thing will burn itself out and the offensive will have visibly failed. So a lot hangs now on assumptions about the state of the Russian military. Is it in the dire condition that John Kirby says it is? If it is, and we've seen that Prigozhin has also said similar things about its condition, and if it has suffered the kind of losses that Kirby says, then perhaps this offensive might succeed. But if, on the contrary, it isn't like that at all, if Russian losses are far less than Kirby imagines, if the Russians do have hundreds of thousands of men in reserve, trained men now, ready to go on the counterattack and to hold back positions, well, then in that case, the situation is completely different. And with the Russians now having the advantage, clear advantage in the air and able to carry out bomb attacks and missile attacks and do all of these things, then of course the situation is different entirely. And in that case, not only will the offensive fail, but Ukraine and the Biden administration could find themselves in a very serious crisis come the autumn, indeed. Well, we don't know. I don't know exactly what the facts are, but all the information I have seen, everything that I have heard and read, makes me think that Russian losses are far fewer than Kirby imagines, that the Russians have not lost large numbers of men. On the contrary, that they've acted to conserve their forces, and that this has been very much their policy throughout the war, and that the Russians, in fact, far from having a chaotic structure and forces out of control, the way that Prigozhin says, and riddled with treason and all of that, that on the contrary, that the Russians now have a stable command system, with Surovikin almost certainly the actual battlefield commander, and that they're prepared for this offensive and they're prepared to meet it head on. Anyway, we shall see how things turn out over the last few weeks. I've made my own opinions clear, and, well, we will see, as I said, how things pan out as things go forward. Now, a short number of other things. The first is that another US bank has failed, a big bank. It's had to be taken over this time by JP Morgan. It's clear that the banking crisis that began a few weeks ago still continues. And for the record, this particular bank that has failed, First Republic, seems to be more of a what one might call conventional mainstream bank than some of the other banks that failed recently and which attracted so much attention. So we'll see what happens and whether this banking crisis really is rumbling away between the surface. I've said previously that The problem with financial crises is that they might be underway for quite a long time without them being obvious or visible to outsiders. I remember that back in the period of the 2008 crisis, the first indications that something was wrong in the Western banking system came in 2007, the summer of 2007, and it started with a bank in France. And over the next few months, there was problems in one bank and another, but overall, things seemed to remain largely under control. There was no sense that things were about to fall apart. We had lots of talk about a credit crunch then. By the way, we're having something of the same talk about a credit crunch now. But anyway, we were having lots of reports like that over the course of the second half of 2007, the first half of 2008. But everything, as I said, seemed to be under control. The economy was expanding. Congress came together and delivered what looked like a package to support the economy, as I remember, in the second half of 2007. And then suddenly, everything went wrong. And in the late summer, autumn of 2008, the financial system basically collapsed. So we could be seeing something similar. I doubt that anybody knows for sure. However, all the indications, again, all the sort of statistics and figures that we're seeing point now to a recession beginning in a few months. That the high interest rates have been draining liquidity from the Western economies. Money supply is becoming tight. Credit conditions are becoming tight. Weaker banks are starting to buckle. And perhaps at some point we're going to see a downward plunge. It's interesting to notice also what's happening to oil prices. Despite attempts by OPEC Plus to support the oil price by production cuts, the oil price continues to fall overall, which looks like oil buyers are predicting a fall in demand, perhaps even a collapse in demand, which is consistent with a recession coming. So that may be what's now looming over the horizon. I know there is a view among some people, some of the economics community in the West, that the central banks have been raising interest rates for too long, that they're underestimating the risk of a recession. I don't think anybody knows for certain. And I think to say that because always one sees somebody who comes forward when the crash happens and says that they predicted it in the way that it happened. And, quite a lot of these people have predicted a crash on a particular day. But I would say that I doubt that anybody absolutely knows for sure. And I know I get lots of people who send me emails saying that they do know and have known and that they've been right. But the fact is, I'm always skeptical about this because I've seen this happen so many times. I don't think anybody can ever say at any particular point in time that there will be a crash or a recession at any specific point in the future. That is not to deny something quite different, which is that overall, the Western financial system has become increasingly fragile and overburdened and brittle and prone to breakdown and perhaps ultimate collapse. That, I think, is true. In fact, I'm sure it's true. That has been true and getting more true for a very long time now. But as I said again, I think that to extrapolate from that and to say definitely, let's say in September or October or December, we're going to see a breakdown and a crisis, I think that realistically we can't know. But what I will say about that is this: if a recession does happen, if there is going to be a serious recession in the West, in Europe, and in the United States, then that is going to have a number of effects. Firstly, in a period of recession, people's interests in news, foreign news, slackens off. Support for a war in a place like Ukraine is going to become increasingly difficult to sustain, impossible most likely. Secondly, incumbent governments, whatever they are, American, British, will find themselves under growing pressure. It might be very, very much more difficult if there is a serious recession for President Biden, who is anyway, shall we say, rather unpopular to get himself re-elected. It becomes much more likely, assuming that Donald Trump is the nominee for the Republican Party, that he might be re-elected and become President Trump again. And as I said, a lot of these grandiose plans that we have now for immediate energy transitions and such things, they could melt away. And also many of the other plans for giant strategic recalibrations, neocon chess games, people will not only become uninterested in them, they're very likely to become impatient with them, as, by the way, happened at the time of the 2008 crisis. So that's one thing I wanted to say. The other is that there's been an absolutely astonishing speech, a bewildering speech by Jake Sullivan, who basically is announcing what some people have called a new Washington consensus. This is a return, in effect, to protectionism, to industrial policy in the United States, to a fostering of high technology industries, to chip production, internally based chip production, all of that. It was the most extraordinary speech, as I said, reversing the entire trend of US policy since, well, at least the Reagan years. And when I say the Reagan years, perhaps the period when these policies were fully embedded as part of the sort of globalization policies, became fully embedded as part of the economic policies of the US. Well, that happened during the Clinton period. Now, I'm going to say two things about this. The first is that what Sullivan is talking about is clearly a retreat. It is clearly, if you take it seriously, an admission that the globalist economic system is breaking down, that the attempt by the United States to globalize the world economy around itself, or perhaps more succinctly, around certain financial institutions and political socioeconomic oligarchs in the United States, oligarchic groups in the United States, has now run its course. That the United States cannot do that any longer. The idea of it running the world, importing cheap goods from overseas, exporting the dollar, with its reserve currency status via endless emission of debt and in the form of treasury bonds. That is unsustainable. And that is, in effect, an admission that in economic terms, the unipolar moment has passed. If the United States is really serious about protectionism, rebuilding domestic supply chains, relocating manufacturing within itself, then, as I said, it is in effect an admission that in economic terms, unipolarity has gone. The second thing to say about this is that, as with everything that comes from people like Jake Sullivan, what this is really about ultimately is about China. When the administration came to office back in 2021, there was a major attempt to boost the economy by a massive surge of spending. And if you drilled through some of the statements that US officials were making at that time, it was quite clear that the intention was to raise the US growth rate, GDP growth rate, to match, and some were even talking about surpassing that of China. Well, it didn't work out like that. As Alex Christoforou and I said at the time on the Duran, what this extra spending would achieve instead was not a sustained increase in growth rates in the United States. It would lead instead to higher inflation. And so it has turned out. So this is, if you like, plan B. Now, we're not going to try and overtake or compete with the Chinese by spending in that kind of way as we did before. We're not going to try a massive stimulus, a demand pull. We're going to take a much more active role, investing in the US economy, forcing the Taiwanese and the South Koreans, strong-arming them in effect, to reinvest high technology in the United States. We're going to build up our domestic supply chains. We're going to use this act, which we've passed, to assist in developing green technologies. We're going to use that to attract industry from Europe. We're going to do all of these things, and we're going to rebuild our industrial, technological base. And at the same time as we're going to do that, we're going to try to deprive the Chinese of high-end chips and high-end technology so that they can't compete with us. That seems to be the major plan. It's less about, in my opinion, raising US living standards. It's not even really about changing the US economic system. It's more about finding another way to compete with China. Now, I don't think this is going to work, and that's my third point, because the way it's all laid out, it's not a real economic or industrial or planning policy at all. That would require something completely different. It would require much more discussion within the United States, planning meetings together, bringing together people like industry specialists, experts, high technology people, finance people, bring them all together, working out a long-term program about how to rebuild the industrial base, setting a realistic planning horizon. It might take 10 years or 20 years or something like that. Once upon a time, the United States did do this sort of thing. I don't really think that people in the United States quite understand how to do it today, and I'm confident that Jake Sullivan doesn't. So it's really another case, if you like, of fantasizing about what you would like to see happen, rather than providing a practical plan about how you would actually achieve it. Now, I have to say that it seems to me that a more likely outcome of this plan, if it is a plan, is not therefore a real rebuilding of US industrial supply chains, but higher domestic spending within the United States, which, if it takes place against, in the context of higher tariff barriers, can only lead to goods shortages and higher inflation, much higher inflation, and perhaps an aggravation, a further aggravation in the economic imbalances within the country. I'm going to finish this by saying that if you really do want to carry out this kind of investment-led industrial policy, and I know, by the way, that there are many people in the United States who are very strongly opposed to this thing. Many of my libertarian friends, I'm not myself a libertarian, but many of my libertarian friends are very hostile to these ideas altogether. They think that this isn't what government ought to be doing, that government should have a much more limited role, that this is big government, it's not going to produce anything good. That's not my own philosophy, that's not my own opinion, but that current of thinking does exist in the United States. And sometimes I have to say I am attracted by its rigor, even if, as I said, my own views differ in many respects. But anyway, if you are going to carry out that kind of policy, what you need to do is to develop a political consensus within the United States behind it. And that political consensus needs to reach out and include all the major stakeholders within the US economy and US society. A government that, on the contrary, is constantly finding enemies to itself within US society, as to an alarming extent the Biden administration, in my opinion, is the least equipped to carry out a program like that. And moreover, in order to carry out such a program, it needs a strong, decisive, commanding leader, an FDR, for example, which, to speak generously, President Biden, in my opinion, is not. So there we go. It's a fascinating comment from Sullivan. I don't think it's been remotely thought through. I don't think he understands very much about chip technology, by the way. I don't think he understands very much about supply chains and things of that kind. After all, he's not got that kind of background at all. I think that this is all very abstract and, shall we say, optimistic. And I think, if I have to be frank, this is another one of those clever speeches that people make from time to time, which, especially if a recession is indeed going to be soon upon us, will vanish, forgotten, beneath the waves of events. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. And in the meantime, please remember you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. Please remember that you can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, then please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. Have a very good day. Let's see whether we do get a Ukrainian offensive within the next few days. I think that is now becoming much more likely than it was, for the reasons I think I've set out in this program. And one way or the other, I will keep you informed and let you know my views. And have a very good day, and more from me soon.